So our next speaker and our main contributor for the day is Sanam Prasad, who is the founder of, one of the founders of Penoyre and Prasad Architecture. Sunand, many of you will know, was our IBA president for 2 years, and as such really championed sustainability and quality of life, and also education and a number of other things. He's chairman of Article 25, the charity, as well, and he's also passionate about the whole issue of how we actually make a good London as we grow. If we grow, picking up on Daniel's point, if we allow growth. I should just talk briefly about the process of this. We haven't all put ourselves together in a room, wrapped white towels around our head, and come up with lots of ideas. There's actually been some really deep conversations which have been going on for over 2 years, and a group of people have come together for various inquiries, expert people, which we've then iterated and come up with a final report. And there's a huge amount of work that has gone into this. And the report authors, besides the GLA people and Transport for London, for the Growing London report that we're going to talk about today, include Richard Powell, Bob Allies and Fiona Scott, as well as the Transport for London and GLA people. Sunand will talk on their behalf today as one of the key authors. So Sunand, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's great to see so many people, wonderful crowded room. I want to start off by adding some more thanks. So bear with me, everybody who's made the great contribution to this report that we are very delighted to publish today. Pat and colleagues on the MDAG, Richard, Bob and Fiona, my colleagues, producing this particular report, and the Assistant Director of Planning, Stuart Murray, and the great team at the GLA who've really done the heavy lifting on this. Finn Williams, Ewan Mills, Alison Mayer. And thank you also to NLA and to David Taylor for his editorial input and transcription of 140 pages of roundtable notes. So the current growth of London, and you hardly need reminding about that, is not unprecedented. It's far from unprecedented. London's grown at greater rates before. But this current phase of growth presents some entirely unprecedented challenges. For example, London becoming unaffordable to Londoners, which would not be a great legacy for a future mayor to be associated with. And much of the discussion today is focused on numbers nowadays. But of course, sufficient quantity is important. But our concern, and we are the Mayor's Design Advisory Group, is actually about quality. It's about where things will be, what will they look like, what sort of neighborhoods will they make, who will build them and who will live there. And we're also conscious that actually we talk about the problems of growth and they seem formidable, but imagine what the problems of decline would be. They'd be much worse. We actually are very lucky to have this growth. And that's why we have set out to talk about what good growth would look like, a growth that everybody in London is recruited to. And this is, of course, the first one of 4 reports, as you've heard, coming soon in weekly intervals. So next 4 breakfasts can be booked already, is Public London, Aging London, and then a bit about the shaping of London, the capacity that we need to deliver all this. So you can see there the growth of London, but also the extraordinary decline in density of London. And before we go further, I just want to be conscious that we are clear what we mean by London. When we talk about London today, we're going to be talking about the GLA boundary because that's what it's all about. But actually, there was an LCC boundary, and some of the older statistics actually talk about that. There's the M25, and then there is this hinterland where people are more likely to be working in London than in the area they live in. And that is a bigger London. There's a UN definition of London. And we need to bear in mind in the background that actually this is not a hard and fast boundary. Now, the London plan envisages accommodating all of London's growth, and that's, as you all know, nearly 50,000 homes a year over 20 years, or 62,000 over 10 years, within the GLA boundary. And unlike ever before, we have to accommodate this growth within the existing city footprint in a highly visible way up against where people already live. And that's what the challenge is. Now, we are not, as you know, hitting the numbers we need. And that's where we started. You don't need to be reminded that we are only building half of what's needed. In the 30s, the private sector built up to 70,000 homes a year, and council and private completions in the late 60s, early 70s got up to 40,000 homes. Since the end of council housing, we're managing around average of 23. The maximum was about 27, 28. The planning system is often blamed for this. And we don't buy that. We think that actually this is one of the myths that we would like to clear away. Of course, the planning system has a role to play, and there may be ways of improving the supply through some adjustments. But there is a little bit of a puzzle here to explain the woeful supply-demand imbalance in London. And we haven't really been able to find a properly researched answer to this, and suspect that it must at least be in part some kind of a market failure connected with things like absorption rates, which is actually, for example, how many homes does a developer estimate that they can sell at a price that doesn't compromise and upset future values. So last year, for example, 26,000 homes were built. It seems to be a ceiling that we've reached. And by the way, of those, just 310 were delivered by local authorities. Now, we think that local authorities must be part of the solution if the problem is to be fixed. We don't see an instant other solution. There are other smaller solutions, but actually this has got to be a part of it. And in a way, what we want to say is let's make it glamorous again for councils to build. Let's talk not so much just about council estates, but maybe the great estates, the example of the great estates. And that means building for the long term, high quality buildings with confidence that we kind of believe in the public realm and what housing might be like. So that's one of our recommendations, and others include proposals to increase the supply of home builders themselves, for example, by facilitating the involvement of more smaller firms and tackling the skills and capacity issues. Now, jobs are just as important to the London economy and therefore to the UK economy. We need workspace for some 35,000 new jobs per year. And sadly, one of the consequences of our reaction to the housing crisis has been to remove workspace. It's estimated that getting on for 1 million square feet, about 850,000 square feet of office space were lost through permitted development in the 2 years from May 2013. So our recommendations there include resisting permitted development rights where this is happening, if that is actually, of course you do a proper test and do a bit of evidence-based thinking, and ensuring that any reallocation of industrial land is properly researched. And that policy, perhaps even Section 106s, can be deployed to facilitate the provision of affordable workspace as well as affordable homes. Now, it's a consistent theme in our work, and you'll see that all the way through the 4 reports, that good growth means that Londoners must be properly engaged and not alienated. Now, we're only delivering half the growth, but there is apparently a lot of burgeoning anxiety. So imagine if it was the full amount, will people be even more anxious? But are they really? Do we really understand this? What is this anxiety about? Our own preliminary surveys don't necessarily show that it's a very clear picture. Generally, people are positive about development and the fact that London is growing, and nobody says it's a bad thing. Of course, as I said earlier, the development is right in front of their noses, and they don't quite know who's going to be living there. There are myths such as it's all for foreign buyers, they're all piggy banks and so on. And of course, some of them are, no question. These are all well-founded, but actually there's no proportionality or evidence base. Actually, it's very much in evidence to put some size around it. So we need to move on from that and, for example, recognize that these concerns are very often age-related. Younger people have different concerns than older people. Health and access to transport are as important as volume and size and so on. But we do, as well as understanding that, need to move on from this era where the interface, the first interface of the planning system with the public is a notice tied to a lamppost, which sometimes slips down so only dogs can read it. But we need a new version of this for the digital era. Linked perhaps to a 3D model of London, which is one of the other recommendations I'll come to in a moment. And we also recommend better use of technology to more thoroughly get to what Londoners will support and make the London Plan, SPGs, etc., more transparent, engaging, and accessible. So Daniel already mentioned the issue of where will the growth go? Will it be exported? Will it be contained? Well, what are the alternatives? Town centres, which are one of the big focuses right now, opportunity areas, suburbs, estate redevelopment, as some people focus on, such as create streets to get the numbers. Genuinely redundant industrial land, certain bits of the green belt, or will it be exported outside the GLA boundary? And our recommendation is actually all of the above. The scale of the growth is such that we have to understand the contribution that each one of these will make, but with a better understanding of the kind of tools we're going to be using, and better tools such as the famous SHLA, the Strategic Housing Land Allocation Assessment. These are brilliant methodologies. I've been personally very impressed by the detail of the research that goes on in the GLA and the understanding of all the sites above 2.5 hectares around the capital. And of course, as this plan shows, the knottiest problem is actually not the green belt, but it's the suburbs. A tiny increase in density in the suburbs will go a very long way to meeting the numbers. And of course, there's no shortage of design solutions. There are many people who are proposing how to do that in a sensitive and efficient way, but there is a big political problem here, and that is one of the knottiest and most intractable issues. We don't have any answers to that, but we just want to flag it up. A surprising result is how powerful it is to use what we already have and how much capacity there really is there. Housing completions are held up as a measure of success, but conversion of houses as well as redundant non-residential buildings have a huge hidden impact. 193,000 new homes were built in the 10 years after 2001, but the net increase was 270,000. We have recommendations to encourage more of this and better use of office space as well. Running like a kind of stick of rock through all these discussions is the issue of density. And again, a great deal of confusion around densities. It's often said that at 50,000 people per square kilometre, London is only a third as dense as Barcelona. Well, that's interesting, but of limited use, of limited practical use. Even more interesting, perhaps, is that 200 years ago, in 1816, if we had those densities, we would now accommodate 35 million people in London. So there's nothing kind of un-London about high densities. But site densities are, of course, something else. And this graphic shows how we can talk about the city density, a neighborhood density, and, of course, spot densities. And today, in London, our spot densities easily match and exceed Hong Kong densities, over some 1,200 dwellings per hectare. But, of course, that is a spot of land fully built up with a tower. And we need to get better at comparing actually the proper impact of these things. And the density itself is a crude stick, incredibly useful though it is. The London Plan, of course, uses dwellings or habitable rooms per hectare, and each of that results in typologies. It combines those with the public transport accessibility level ratings to produce a density matrix, and that is a key driver of, at the moment, of policy. But there are now large numbers of applications totally outside the matrix in a range where towers are inevitable. We are off the top right-hand corner of that chart in terms of a large number of applications which are now coming through. And much of that can be accommodated in low and medium rise. But what's now being proposed cannot. So I've long thought, well, density is not a problem. We look at Ladbroke Grove and so on. But actually, we are building at even higher densities, and we need to understand that. And our recommendations include improvements to the way we use PTAL ratings, including, for example, the ATOS, which is the Access to Opportunities and Services rating, and other ratings that are already in the London plan to make all of this a little more granular. And a key recommendation is to explicitly build in tiered levels of planning tests to increase the stringency of tests in higher densities, and that obviously has very important implications for tall buildings. Now, someone said in one of our round tables, if you were designing a system for funding public infrastructure through development again, you wouldn't start from here. And everybody throws up their hand and says, you're right, 106, as a way of providing social housing and social infrastructure, we just haven't worked out, if you get planners really talking about it. But that's the system we have. And being pragmatic, we have to somehow make the best use of it until something else can be put in place. But we need to be alert to the unintended consequences, and that has been a constant theme in our work. So, for example, if you lay the burden of site preparation, public infrastructure provision, all those things on the left, onto the development, the inevitable result is a drive up of the density, because they have to be paid for. The scheme has to wash its own face, and you can almost directly translate the volumetric of the physical, you can derive that from the nature of the financing. So our recommendations include greater transparency of viability appraisals. Many people have been asking for that, and Section 106 heads of terms, and investigation in the longer term of a more proportionate mechanism for financing public infrastructure, including capture of increasing land values. And we think that we should implement the demand management and shift of behavior in transport that affects commuting peaks, for example. There's interesting work done in the 2050 London Infrastructure Plan that shows how we can actually, if people were encouraged to travel through policy and maybe fair pricing at different times of day, you'd be able to make far better use of the existing infrastructure. You can't avoid the issue of tall buildings, and this cunningly titled "The Place of Tall Buildings," assuming that there is a place for them, is of course a very live issue. Last year, 263 buildings over 20 stories were in the development pipeline, and by the way, 79 of the 85 applications for tall buildings were approved. Despite a large number of policies, there are no shortage of policies about tall buildings. Many boroughs have their own ones, and we have, of course, the CABE, English Heritage one, that some of us played a part in many years ago. But it's all about what can't be built, and it leaves a lot of space for what can be built. And so where you can't build with the corridors and so on is well defined, and there's actually very little about the other areas. And actually, to me, this is one of the areas where there's a real triumph of development control over planning and plan making. And I think to start with, let's have that London-wide 3D model to visualize proposals that can be accessed on the web and readily updated, and try to move the London-wide policies beyond the view management framework, etc., to set down where you can and cannot build and how you can and cannot build, to be plan-led again, to be more predictive rather than take everything on a case-by-case basis. Now, many people say, that's the only way the British planning system works, but everyone has been banging on about this, including the Farrell Review, and logically there is no other answer. And we need to get better because we're actually still quite new at this kind of large volumes of tall buildings, better tools and methodologies to assess the aggregate visual, environmental, social impact, and such as microclimate and so on, about which we had some very great things. We are very good at the numbers. We are very good at working out how many planning applications got through, how long it took the year before. We have great quantitative monitoring of the planning system. but we need to get better feedback on the qualitative impacts of policy. And again, this is an area of unintended consequences. For example, policies against single-aspect north-facing flats can lead to layouts which don't have any regard to context. Bicycle storage requirements can lead to poor frontages, and so on. We can list many of these unintended consequences. The policies are all great, but the system needs help in implementing them. And we need people who can apply the policy intelligently, monitor the results. And we recommend improvement to the annual monitoring review. Some of these things will be dealt with the last of these breakfast talks and launches about shaping London. And we think, apart from improving the annual monitoring review to include quality measures and developing planning guidance that includes typologies developed by skilled designers that show how quality can be retained while these highly well-intentioned policies are implemented. And in the final section, we deal with management and maintenance of buildings, which is, of course, several times the investment that capital projects, the capital cost, the first cost of buildings requires. Management maintenance some 15 times more over a lifetime than the cost of building. High service charges, which are a result of management maintenance, can penalize some of the people least able to afford them. And as a result, some people have argued against high density, not necessarily just super or hyper density, but just high density with development of flats. But we have an anomaly here, which is actually in the suburbs, the common parts are paid for by the taxpayer and to some extent by the council charge payer. Whereas in a flattered or higher density development, the common parts, if you take the route all the way up to your front door, has to be paid for by the people who live there. And they are effectively subsidizing, we are therefore subsidizing the suburbs, same amount of external space. It seems there's something funny here, which is that surely it's more sustainable and economic to be at a optimum density than at the very low density of suburbs. Can we use council charges and rate reliefs and so on to do something about that? And our recommendations then include research on the actual management and maintenance costs and the impact on service charges on different typologies, and more guidance on achieving mixed and balanced communities. So we perhaps chewed off, bit off, chewed off, yeah. We chewed a lot, but we bit off perhaps more than we could chew. I certainly, I think I've just about managed it in the time. But at the outset, we thought that there was more heat than light in the debate and about the future form. And we set out to really deal with some of the myths and spread some information. And if we've cleared away some of that and achieved a little bit of clarity, at least it'll inform the debate, and that would be a great start. Thank you.